So here we are. My name is Bob Klug. I'm a recently retired metallurgical and materials engineer. And over the last 40 years, I've developed stainless steels, high temperature alloys, conducted R&D programs and processes in forgings and castings, and done a significant number of failure analysis investigations. But one of my passions has always been in the area of archeo-metallurgy, which is a study of materials and processes related to history. So when my wife and I moved here to San Diego, we found ourselves volunteering down at the San Diego Maritime Museum. And a wonderful place, have a number of ships, tall ships, so we could both crew them and do maintenance on the ships. But one of the principal vessels that they have down there is the Star of India. And the Star of India is the most complete iron hull ship of its era. And so, of course, I'm intrigued. It's an iron hull ship. And I must admit that I did beg a little bit down there to see if they could get me a couple samples of the iron hull ship so that I could do an analysis of it. And so before I start into that, there's a couple things that I need to do to give you some background here. One is the background of the Star of India. So let me read you a little bit here. The Star of India started life in November 14th, 1863. She was launched from the shipyards of Gibson, McDonald, and Arnold. The shipyard in the town of Ramsey on the Isle of Man is located between England and Ireland. And she began there as a three-masted full-rigged ship called the Euterpe. The Greek muse of lyric and poetry. And between 1863 and 1897, she sailed around the world 21 times, taking cargo and passengers between England, India, New Zealand, and other ports. She was later sold a couple of times to various companies where she operated between Hawaii and San Francisco. And in 1901, she was re-rigged as a bark and renamed the Star of India. And she sailed yearly from San Francisco to Alaska and supported the salmon packing industry. Finally, in 1926, she was sold to the Zoological Society of San Diego, where she languished until 1967, when the citizens of San Diego supported her restoration to sail again. So here's this lovely ship, iron hull ship. And I was very interested because there were a couple different processes going on in history in the 1860s. And the question was, which process was the premier process? But before I go into a lot of that and dive into it, there's a couple terms and definitions that I need to clear up here. One is, what is iron and what is steel? And then I'm going to give you a slight brief overview of the iron and steel industry, just to give us a common ground. So let's look at iron. Iron is an element. It's a pure element, and in a crystal, it's a big atom. And carbon is a very small atom. And when you combine carbon with iron, that's a steel. And so because carbon atom is a small atom, it can soak in or diffuse very easily into the iron crystal structure. And so a little bit of carbon makes a big difference in how the alloy steel behaves. So let's look at what we call a phase diagram. This is what we're seeing here now is a phase diagram. And this is one of the instruments that the metallurgists use. It looks at a along this axis, we have pure iron. And as we go up, you'll see the temperature goes up. So for pure iron, the melting point is about 2,800 degrees Fahrenheit. And as we go across the bottom of this axis, we're increasing the amount of carbon. So here's 2% carbon, 3% carbon, 4% carbon, etc. And what you'll notice is that the melting point of the pure iron goes down as we add carbon to it. And it goes down to a point which we call a eutectic, the lowest melting point, and that's about 4% carbon. And that's where we get cast iron. Cast irons are a very useful product. You know, we make pans and pots and big housings for machinery out of cast iron, but it's pretty brittle. If you hit it with a hammer, because of these big graphite flakes that you see in here in this matrix of iron, it fractures pretty easily. So it's not a very forgeable material. You can't forge it or roll it or shape it very easily. So what we can do is we can reduce the carbon in this iron by taking the cast iron and passing hot air over the top of it, over the surface of it. And because the carbon atom is so small, it just goes off into the atmosphere, combines with oxygen, creates CO2 and goes off. And so if you keep it warm, very hot, maybe very warm, up about 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit, and you keep passing air over it, it will decrease the amount of carbon in it. It'll go off into the atmosphere. And so you move back across this periodic table to a position where you now have what we call pearlite, which is this lamellar type structure with carbide along the crystal boundaries. If we continue to move it across here, we reach an area here called the eutectoid region. And this is another low point, and this is 0.8% carbon. And here is where pearlite is 100%. So you get all of this type of structure. And pearlite is a composite of iron and these very thin laths or layers of carbide. And it's pretty forgeable material. It's very, very tough. And we make a lot of like piano wire out of it. It's very, very tough. So if we continue to take the carbon out, we eventually get down here into this area 3, where it's the iron is predominant, and we only see a little bit of pearlite in between the crystalline structure of the iron. And so this again is very forgeable, but we really want to drive this down to a very low range, less than 1%, or less than 0.2% carbon is where we like to see it. And this is called a low carbon steel or iron in most cases. And so this is a very forgeable product. In other words, we can work this very easily and make product out of it pretty easily. And this is where we can get a lot of things that we can make out of it, like ships and cars and trains, washing machines. It's very easy to form. And so this again is what we call a low carbon steel. So where do we go from here? Well, let's look at the history of steel making. And the history of steel making, we know that people were aware of iron and steel for centuries. 3,000 to 4,000 years ago. They found sponge iron, iron-rich ores, hematite, and they found they could refine them. They have found small refined areas of iron, low carbon iron in furnaces, small furnaces. And so we knew that there were some of those quite early on. And but these forgeable materials became more pronounced by the Chinese, the Japanese, the Chinese, the Romans, the Persians, and the Indian civilizations, where they were very good at reducing the carbon in the iron and making very forgeable materials. They also started working a lot with heat treating, quenching and tempering it. And that again is in this time frame here around 2,000, 3,000 degrees, or 2,000, 300,000 years ago. But again, the quantities were pretty small, only maybe 20 to or 2 to 30,000 pounds per heat at any one time. And so over the next 1,800 years, there was some improvement in this forging process. It was pretty slow, but they were able to improve their forging and their heat treatment of properties, and so and adjust the properties quite well. But by the late 1600s to early 1700s, so from about here to about here, there was a real big upturn in what we call blast furnace technology. And so blast furnace technology means removing iron from ore. And that greatly expanded over this time period between 1600s, late 1600s and 1700s. And so they were able to produce a large quantities, much larger quantities of cast iron. So again, cast iron still has 4% carbon in it, so it was a very useful product, but it wasn't very forgeable. And one of the big drivers to blast furnace technology was they changed fuel from wood to coke. And so this was occurring, and they were able to produce a lot of cast iron, but now the real big bottleneck came in refining that cast iron. In other words, refining and reducing and controlling carbon content to make it more ductile and easily forged. And so there were two processes that were competing: puddling furnaces, what we call puddling furnaces, open hearth processes, and the Bessemer process, which is coming into this. And this was right about the time that the Star of India and a lot of these iron-hauled ships were being produced. And so let's look at some of these two processes, in particular the open hearth process and the Bessemer process. So here's the open hearth process, or the puddling process. Initially, what they found is that if they built a fire and they had this big reflecting surface, and the heat could come up here and they have air flowing across this large, shallow pool of molten cast iron or iron, they could remove a lot of this carbon and go up the stack of CO2. It was a long process. It took quite a while, and they developed these really big brick furnaces. Oh, these were probably 3-4 times the size of your living room, and huge furnaces. And the open hearth process was developed near the end of this, and it was improved pretty significantly by Siemens and Martin, where they designed these really huge open hearth furnaces where they had molten steel or molten iron in here, and they'd roll the hot air and recycle it around, mix it with fuel, and come back through and reduce the carbon level down to a low carbon forgeable steel. So, but now notice that this was in 1864. That was the most efficient and best process that these processes had developed at that time. And this was about a year after the Star of India was launched. So let's look at the other process. The other process that came into being was what we call the Bessemer process. And Henry Bessemer was a British fellow that developed this process and patented it in 1856. So this was just before the Star of India was produced. Now, this is a technology that was kind of around for a little while. It had been indicated a number of times in the past, but Bessemer really took it to the maximum range. And what he did is he had these big teardrop-shaped vessels where he could had these what we call tweers or pipes down in the bottom of this steel, this pot, and they pour cast iron into this, molten cast iron, and they blow air and gases up through to boil off through the liquid iron and reduce the carbon dioxide. And so if you look at the process, what they did is they tilted it, they poured in this liquid cast iron, they tripped it back up, and they blow it off. In other words, drive air and gases up through it. It was a very aggressive process to blow down the carbon. And they very quickly have this low carbon steel that they could pour back off and then forge again, cool it down, solidify it, and forge it. And you can see here the size of the vessel relative to a person standing next to it. Now this process, the Bessemer process, was able to produce low carbon steel in minutes, whereas the open hearth process took hours, on the order of 8 or 9 hours. So this meant a lot. What happens now is we have two competing events that occurred. One is we have an abundance of cast iron that's forged by the blast furnaces. And now we have a process where we can reduce the carbon in that cast iron very low and produce a forgeable steel or iron, low carbon iron, that we could easily forge and make into products. And so the result was of these two events occurring is that the price of these low carbon steels dropped significantly, like an order of magnitude. I've had a couple of ideas about this, how much it dropped. For an example, it went from about 70 to 7 English pounds per long ton, which is huge. And so what this did is this helped drive the industrial revolutions. Now we could build locomotives, we could build cars, we could build bridges, big things. So this helped drive the industrial revolution. And this techniques and these technical advances that we saw occurring in the late 1800s continue unabated now, and to a point in our world where steel today is the most used and recycled material in the world. And because that is oftentimes underappreciated. But be it as it may, we have a thriving industry due to these technologies that have developed. So now let's look at what I was able to get from the Star of India. Ideally, I wanted to get 2 samples, at least 2 samples from 2 different locations on the boat. I also wanted to do a microstructural examination and a chemistry to see if I could distinguish whether it was the open hearth process or the Bessemer process that was used to produce the steel that the Star of India has. So here's where I got 2 samples. One is they had drilled a hole in the side of the hull and pulled out a plug. And so this is the location right on the side of the ship where they put this pipe in, and that's where the plug location was. And so here's an example, or here's a photograph of the plug. This is the outer surface, and this is the through thickness of the plug. Here's the inner surface, and here's the through thickness of the plug. So I was able to get that sample, and also I was able to get another piece of what we call a rub rail. And the rub rail is this white line all the way around the side of the ship. And as you can see here, my wife and I actually hung off the side of the ship and cut off this piece because the rivet that held it in had failed and it was bulging out. So we have to replace that. So I got a piece of that, and this is the rub rail, and here is the rivet. This is the outside of the rivet of the rail, so it's not extremely apparent, but if you flip it over, here's the bottom of the rivet coming through. And so what I did is I cut this through the section here, and then I cut this through this way so that I could look at the microstructure of the section through both the rub rail and the rivet. And so what I did is I mounted it, we polished it, and we etched it so that we could see some of the constituents or the product that made up this material. And as you can see, it is a forged material. Here's the rivet. Here's the rail, and the rail is going out in that direction. And you can see how it was forged. And here, where you can see where it was swaged, the rivet was swaged in to hold the rail to the side of the ship. And so when we look at this, we see these, what we look like as stringers here. And these are non-metallic inclusions, or as we refer to it in the steel industry today, dirty steel. But these are non-metallic inclusions in the material. If we look at higher magnifications of it, what we see is, and this is perpendicular to the rub rail, and these lines here are the crystal structure boundaries of one crystal of iron and another crystal of iron and another crystal of iron. And you'll see these non-metallic inclusions along the boundaries of those crystals. If you look at it parallel to the rub rail, you'll see again, here's the crystals and here's those stringers all stretched out in the direction in which it was forged. So it was forged in this direction. So the first thing we did is we took this sample and we took the other sample and we put them in the scanning electron microscope. And the reason we did this is we wanted to do a localized, or what we call a spot analysis of the matrix of the material and these stringers. And what you do is when you look at it in a scanning electron microscope, you're bombarding it with electrons, and from that, you get a spectra like this down here with iron peaks and silicon peaks and oxygen peaks, and we can run it through a computer analog and it'll give you an elemental analysis, semi-quantitative, so it's approximately what the chemistry is or what the number of elements are, percentage of elements that we see. And so this is the Hall sample and this is the rub rail sample. And we did a sample of the matrix and the stringer in both of those. And what we see here is if you look at the matrix, sure enough, it's a low carbon steel in both those samples. If you look at the stringers, you see, yeah, carbon and iron, but we also see a lot of oxygen, which makes sense because they're non-metallic oxides. So oxygen combined with things like silicon and phosphorus to form these stringers or inclusions. But the interesting thing is, look at the high phosphorus content that we see in here. And that was kind of unusual. It was a good marker for the different types of processes that we wanted to explore. So the next thing we did is we took this sample, the rub rail and the rivet, and we took them to a laboratory that did a detailed analysis. And this detailed analysis was what we call an optical emission spectrometry. So it's very detailed analysis, gives us real good quantities. And I put the chemistries in here along with the standards of steel for a low carbon steel that we have today called A36 carbon steel, which is a low carbon steel. So a 0.026 max carbon. And what we see on the rivet and the rub rail is, sure enough, they're very low carbon. The manganese was within spec, silicon is within spec. What's interesting though is the phosphorus is huge. There's a significant amount of phosphorus in both the rivet and the rub rail compared to what we see in standard steels that we use today. And also the sulfur is a little bit on the high side, but it's okay. So from this, we're able to draw a couple of interesting conclusions. One of the things that we know is that the open hearth process uh, was very good at reducing the carbon, but it took a long time. But what it did not do is, aside from reducing the carbon, it didn't really affect the phosphorus or the sulfur much at all. Those didn't go away. They were still there in the open hearth processed low carbon steel. The Bessemer process, on the other hand, with this very volatile process, would drive out both the carbon and the phosphorus and the sulfur and also the silicon. It reduced the silicon quite a bit as well. So what can we conclude from all of this? Well, there's a couple things that we can conclude. One, that the iron for the manufacture of the Star of India was produced by the open hearth process and not the Bessemer process. So that was pretty clear by the amount of phosphorus that we saw in it. Almost all of the iron haul ships that were produced in the late 1800s using this open hearth process have either been recycled or remelted at this point. Most of them have been recycled and reused. So very few of them are available or still afloat, still around. And of the surviving ships that are still around, some of them have been restored, but the majority of those that have been restored have used modern clean steel technology or clean steel in the restoration. So what that really tells us is that we have a very unique relic in the Star of India. It truly is the most complete original iron haul ship still afloat. And it is incredible that this beautiful ship was made from the open hearth process, which is one of those things that we tend to overlook. And you're very unique and unbelievably beautiful thing to have here in the city of San Diego. Now, there's a couple final notes that I wanted to go on here about. Engineering has been a real exciting part of my life, and I really enjoy it, the time that I spent with it. It's not over. I still love to do engineering. But you may ask yourself, what do you find so interesting about history? You know, that's all old stuff that goes on. And case in point, the open hearth process itself has a history that goes back, 2,000 years or so. It's a viable process even up until 1990s was when the last open hearth process plant was closed. The Bessemer process, we do know that that goes back at least in 1700s in Japan, and also to the 11th century in China. There were variations of that idea of blowing air through the molten cast iron to reduce the carbon to make it more forageable. And the interesting thing was the Bessemer process, for all of its wonders and work during that late 1800s, it was eventually replaced, and there are no more Bessemer processes being used. It was replaced in 1968 by what we call a basic oxygen furnace. And one of the big difficulties with it was that it used very little scrap metal. It used cast iron and not recycled or cast material. And cast material is now largely used for a lot of our steel production, and it uses a very large electric arc furnace. So history provides a longer, deeper view of civilization and processes and progress as it goes through. Usually things don't just spring into life complete, but result from a very slow, ongoing process. Work and efforts often seem to be lost or forgotten. You know, we think, well, suddenly they regain prominence, and just when the time is right. So I found that more often than not, a slow and steady effort combined with a clear vision of what is possible is a wonderful thing. So I really want to thank you all for your attention, and I do hope that this presentation has been both entertaining and informative. I'd also like to thank the San Diego County Engineering Council for both the opportunity to do this and the platform to make it, to help me present this. So thank you very much. I do appreciate your time and effort.